Ottoman's book is good insofar as it describes the collapse of the traditional separation between the ulama and the state, with the suspension of the Ottoman constitution in 1876 and the codification of law, so that from that period onwards the law became the responsibility of the state, which had never been historically in Islam. In Islamic traditional polities or government, the government has no right to pass laws. That's the job of the ulama, who are a separate establishment. And Feldman points out how that difference was collapsed, so that the ulama had the law taken away from them, and the state, the sultan, became the source of the law. And that led to a certain type of absolutism, sort of dictatorial power, which he sees as being the basic problem with a lot of Middle Eastern regimes today, because the power of the ulama simply is nothing. They have no clout in society any longer. They can preach, but do nothing more. But in terms of implementation of Sharia, it all depends on which interpretation you're talking about. It really does. The Sharia is mistranslated as Islamic law or as Sharia law. That's taking something from a very non-Western understanding of how law and morality operate and putting them in a Western vocabulary. It suggests that the Sharia is some kind of equivalent to English common law or French law or Roman law, as if it's a single codified body of rules. It's never been that. It's a huge, diverse legal tradition, and it evolves historically. The Sharia as understood and interpreted in the 1st century is very different from the Sharia as understood and practiced in the 5th century. The Sharia of the 19th century is different from the Sharia that exists in Muslim jurisdictions nowadays. So when journalists say Islamic law is being introduced in such and such a place, it doesn't actually tell you anything. Whose interpretation? There's no guy at the top, no pope, who can say this is right and this is wrong. It's a process of negotiation. We have no notion of where that negotiation will lead the Muslim world in the next few decades. Somewhere good, somewhere bad, somewhere correct, somewhere not so correct, we don't know. But there's no generic issue of Sharia and Western statutory law. There are local negotiations, often very difficult, but there is no single issue as far as I can see. Did you have a question? Are you impatiently waiting?
My question keeps changing, I'm afraid, as the discussion goes on, but if I can ask one. You pointed out that the term the West actually includes all kinds of different things. And you also pointed out that the Christian faith has a somewhat minimal influence on contemporary culture and thought. I wonder if you could comment on to what extent you think that our present culture has been shaped historically by the Christian faith.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, what are the distinctively Christian elements or the elements that have come from a Christian influence that are still part of what it means generally to live in Britain today?
Yeah, I mean, that probably is a question that's outside my competence. Obviously, we have formal survivals from certain settlements that took place following the Reformation, such as the establishment of the Church of England, such as speakers' prayers in Parliament, the bench of bishops in the House of Lords, certain things like blasphemy legislation and other things that are still there and look a bit anachronistic but aren't actually going away. More generically in society, I would say that there is no obvious continuity between the British religious culture of, say, Puritan England and our modern reality. I think if Cromwell could be transported forward in time 400 years, it'd say this is some kind of dreadful orgy and Christianity is finished. I think it'd probably be wrong. But it's very hard to point to any individual institution or habit of mind that you can say is specifically Christian, but is widespread in modern Britain, that is not kind of generically religious or ethical. In some Catholic countries you can see these things like abortion and some of the euthanasia debates obviously come from a specifically Catholic ethical tradition. Here, unfortunately, because I personally would rather live in a more strongly Christian country than currently exists, it's very hard to point to any given feature of British culture and say, oh, that's from the Christian heritage. We've become profoundly secular. Maybe you could think of something that has survived. I mean, there are certain ethical values that are widespread in Britain that are kind of generically subsumed under the love thy neighbour label, but the Japanese would say, well, we have that as well.
Yeah.
Great speech. Why do Muslims have to pray 5 times a day, and if you don't, can you still be a Muslim?
One prays 5 times a day because this is a divine commandment that was given to the Holy Prophet at the Ascension. The exact reason why it's those specific times is known only unto God. The experience of praying is that you are connected to space and time in a way that links the body and the soul. Muslim worship is a very embodied experience, and there's something almost geometric about orienting yourself towards the city of Mecca, about your whole life being shaped by the rhythm of worship, which is shaped by the movement of the planet beneath your feet, knowing when the sun rises, knowing when the sun sets, things that human beings used to know until almost living memory and now have no idea about, really grounds you in the reality of being part of the solar system and part of the earth and the seasons. That's a very healthy thing. If you don't pray, that depends. If you say, I'm too lazy to pray, you're still a Muslim, according to all schools of Islamic law. If you say, I don't like prayer, and I think God was wrong to say it was 5 times a day, I think it should have been 6 times or 4 times, formally speaking, that takes you outside the boundaries of the religion. Well, properly speaking, in most forms of Sharia, if you're living outside a Muslim majority country and you're a Muslim male, you can't marry a Christian or a Jew. If you actually look it up, you'll find they say that's only for the Dar al-Islam, because the ambient culture will compensate for any confusion that the child's mind might experience as a result of the difference of religion between the parents. If you're living in the West, then the child's confusion might continue, therefore it's not permissible. Imam al-Nawawi has a long fatwa on this, which is quite interesting. But the general principle, the traditional principle, is that the husband is understood to be the head of the family. He's the one who leads the prayer. He's the one who dictates the spiritual, religious nature of the household, and the children religiously will follow him. And therefore, given that Islam is concerned for the spiritual well-being of the new generation, it doesn't matter so much if the wife is not a believer, as it would if the head of the family was not a believer. It's a patriarchal assumption, if you like, but in most families it's still today a valid one. At last. Why did I become a Muslim? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was very generous. Not because I deserved anything or was thinking carefully, but he decided that somebody needed a bit of help, so alhamdulillah, here I am.